Dr. Francis Peace Sullivan to Conversatario Cubano. We are really delighted to have you here, particularly because you have now published your first book with the University Press of Florida, and it is part of the Caribbean Crossroads series, so one of the very first books in that series. The title of the book is Cuba's Cosmopolitan Enclaves, Imperialism, Internationalism in Eastern Sugar Towns. So the book is really a wonder in many respects. And one of the things that makes it fascinating is that it focuses on the period of the 1920s to the 1930s, when in many ways sugar and Cuba were at pivotal moments in their history, and workers as well, as probably the most important part of the landscape, human landscape and political landscape in that moment. So I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about what life was like in these Eastern sugar towns and why, in fact, you used the term cosmopolitan enclaves in your title.
Sure, I would be delighted to. But first, I want to say thank you so much for asking me to do this interview and for taking the time to do it. And thank you also, Professor Guerra, for your incredible feedback on my manuscript, which you read as one of the series editors for the Caribbean Crossroads series. So I'm so grateful. So yes, life in the sugar towns and why I call them cosmopolitan enclaves. But, by way of background, I just want to say that this book is about these spaces on the northern coast of Cuba's Oriente province, where in the early 20th century, U.S. sugar companies set up shop and basically established massive agricultural export enclaves. And in these enclaves, they built and controlled everything they needed to grow, harvest, process, and ship out sugar. So that means they controlled the docks and the railroads and the workers' housing and schools and hospitals and basically everything, even down to the rural guard post. And so that's why we call them enclaves. And so a few key features about these enclaves: people came from across the Americas to work in them. So they're incredibly diverse spaces. And by far the largest stream of immigrants or migrants to these enclaves were Afro-Caribbean workers who were there to cut the cane and work in sugar factories. Over 300,000 Afro-Caribbean immigrants came to Cuba between 1900 and 1933. They're really the backbone of the sugar economy. They're largely coming from the British West Indies and Haiti. So for a variety of reasons, we tend to think of these spaces as closed or cut off, remote, and the reasons are good. For imperialists and anti-imperialists agree about this point. So the imperialists, the company executives and the company administrators, want to insulate the sugar production process, from the vagaries of Cuban society, all that they find distasteful of Cuban society and politics, and so they design them as sort of self-contained spaces. And for the anti-imperialists, these enclaves represent a loss of sovereignty. And so they also emphasize cutoffness, isolation. A few regarding banana enclaves in Central America, some scholars have done excellent work debunking this idea of isolation, leading scholars like Catherine LeGrand and Lara Putnam. So regarding Cuba, I follow their lead. And what I began to figure out as I researched this book is that these enclaves are deeply integrated into transnational flows of capital and labor and goods and politics and ideas. And that's what this book is really about, is the final thing that they're deeply integrated into are international flows of internationalist activism. So how does this look? And to answer your question, what does it look like? People are reading international newspapers. They're well-versed in world events. They form this vibrant civic life where there's associations, Masonic lodges, mission societies, different cultural clubs, national clubs, vibrant civic life where many of these institutions have lending libraries where they're kind of collecting newspapers to share information about the world. Things are being shipped in and shipped out, obviously, and all those ships are manned by merchant mariners who are sharing information. Foreigners and Cubans are stopping through town whenever they want to organize or drum up support for some cause or another cause. And so there's all these people coming in from the outside talking to the residents of these enclave towns. I should say that the center of the book that I focus most on is called Banes. And it's where the United Fruit Company, the world famous United Fruit Company, centered its operations during this era. And so, Banes was a major stopover in anybody kind of raising political support or, drumming up money for some cause. So the bottom line is that in many ways, in the 1920s and 30s, the sugar towns of the Northeast were among the most cosmopolitan places on the island. They're right up there with Havana and Santiago. And my book takes this cosmopolitanness as a starting point. It's not the argument in and of itself, it's the starting point. Because then what happens with this civic life that I've just described as like the breeding ground is you see local residents engaging in really important movements for transnational race and class solidarity. And the three that I cover are the global Garvey movement, if you've heard of Marcus Garvey, and the Universal Negro Improvement Association, which, is still the largest Black organization the world has ever seen, or was at the time, and it has not been surpassed in numbers. It took off in this region. Banes was a major hub of Garveyism. International communists were trying to organize in the region, and in fact, globally, the world was looking into Cuba, to northeastern Cuba, during the revolution of 1933. And then later in the 30s, you have people in the region mobilizing around support for the Spanish Republic during the Spanish Civil War. They're collecting money and sugar and medical supplies in order to support the Republican cause against Franco's fascist insurrection during this time. So what I'm really interested in is how these towns are steeped in all of this. And Cosmopolitan Enclaves is like supposed to be a cute play on words, that it's counterintuitive, right? They're supposed to be cut off, but they're actually quite steeped in all of this.
So one of the extraordinary aspects of the book is its examination of the relationship between sugar workers and the Cuban Communist Party, especially in the lead up to what we know as the social revolution of 1933 in Cuba. You argue that the Cuban Communist Party actually took a backseat to the activism of sugar workers in the lead up to the 1933 revolution. So I wonder if you could explain to us just how important the Communist Party was in the region or among sugar workers at the time. And then also if you could explain to us that activism on the part of workers, a relationship between the Communist Party and the workers themselves in this region.
Sure. Thank you. I would love to do that. So Party, which is called PCC for its Spanish name. If your viewers or readers, listeners, don't know much about it, I can just give a quick summary, which is the party's established in 1925. And then it goes back and forth in terms of popularity. It's almost immediately suppressed, run underground. And then as President Gerardo Machado is less and less popular, the party emerges as more popular in 1930. It's sort of a high point, but then in 31, it's underground again. So there's all this back and forth about what the party is and isn't able to do in terms of organizing the masses, right? But what I think is really interesting is that throughout these early years of the Communist Party, they're not really trying to organize sugar workers. Some major founders of Cuban communism, Julio Antonio Mejia, he spent time in Banes. He's been there. He's inspired by it, but they're not really trying to organize the sugar workers. And there's a lot of reasons for this. One is just tactical, logistical. They can't, the company owns the railroads to get to town. And in that sense, it's just difficult work. But other reasons are, and I think this is kind of important, and Barry Carr has said as much, as well as Tony Wood a little bit, that the party considered sugar workers just too foreign, perhaps too Black, and too rural to organize. And they didn't make strides amongst this group for at least the first 5 years. Things begin to change internationally. Again, I think my book, what I try to do, I hope I succeed in doing, is showing the different inside-outside connections. And so there's a lot of inside looking out connections, but one outside looking in connection is that beginning in 1928, the global communist movement led by Moscow kind of enters this new era. Anybody familiar with communist history will know that this is called the third period. But basically, Moscow is telling across the world to organize the masses, to become a true leader of the proletariat everywhere, and in particular, to organize Black people and to fight for Black liberation. And so that, by the way, I would be remiss if I didn't say Moscow didn't come up with this because it's brilliant on its own. It came up with this because Pan-African intellectuals and diasporic figures are pushing them to do so. But anyway, so they're pushing that the global communist movement is changing. And what you have in terms of the PCC and their relationship to sugar workers is all of these really interesting international conversations in New York and Moscow and Montevideo, Buenos Aires, and in Cuba, of course, where people begin to take seriously the importance of organizing workers for imperialist agricultural companies. And so that includes the banana workers in Central America, the oil workers, I said agricultural, but I include oil here, the oil workers in North and South America. But the idea and especially the sugar workers in Cuba. So all of these international intellectuals are thinking really seriously, what do we do about the heart of imperialism, right? The resource extraction industries of Latin America, including one Cuban organizer named Sandalio Junco, Afro-Cuban organizer. And so eventually between the kind of PCC rising again in popularity and the international communist movement making this point and PCC intellectuals themselves making this point, the Communist Party begins a sugar campaign. And I could go into great detail about that, but maybe I won't bore you. The bottom line is in 1932, they really pushed organized sugar workers. And at the beginning of the year, they're not really talking about the British West Indians and the Haitians. They're talking about factory workers, they're talking about transportation workers. They're still not really able to take seriously the revolutionary potential of foreign workers. But by the end of the year, they're sort of getting it. And then what happens next, and that's kind of built into your question, is the Revolution of 33, explodes everything. And so I might pause here to just explain briefly what the Revolution of 33 is. Is that okay?
Please.
Okay.
I love that.
Sure, you don't need any explanation. But for for anybody who wants a refresher, the Revolution of 33 is when the popular forces execute, find a way to remove General Geraldo Machado from office, from the presidency. In August, he flees, and then eventually in his place, there's a reformist president, Ramon Grau San Martin, who has a super leftist interior minister, Antonio Gutierrez. And unfortunately for both of those figures, Fulgencio Batista is kind of at the helm of the military. And so the Grau administration launches 100 days of reform. Eventually, this reform is overturned or squashed by Batista, who is catapulted to power when he orchestrates Grau's removal in January of 34. So that's the recap of the revolution. But sugar workers of Northern Oriente, this crazy thing, this really remarkable event, the more I think about it, the more I realize it's just so incredible, happens when in the final months of from August to December and even into January of 33 to 34, sugar workers launched this massive island-wide insurrection. Over 220,000 workers go on strike. They, and in some cases, they take over the mills. They take over the property. They occupy the property. They raise red flags over the chimney. They form red militias to protect their strike. They requisition cattle and land, and the workers' wives are going around to the different neighboring peasantries and collecting, fruits and vegetables to use for the strikers. And in some cases, they held the properties for months. In some cases, it was a matter of days. So in the region I study, for instance, the United Fruit Company, they held the property for 8 days, completely paralyzing production, which is, this is the world famous United Fruit Company. And then nearby at the Tasajo mill, workers held it for months, and they called it a Soviet. So this is really interesting. And I want to emphasize that throughout all this process, Afro-Cuban, Afro-Caribbean, so British West Indians, all of whom are called Jamaican, whether or not they're actually from Jamaica, British West Indians and Haitians are participating. There's also Chinese workers participating alongside Cubans. And I have all these communist propaganda documents, or not even propaganda, just post-mortem documents, in which they're assessing what went well, what went poorly. And they keep saying, like, in many cases, the foreigners were the most militant. So they're really kind of coming around to the revolutionary potential of sugar workers. So then the argument that I make in the book, many ways.
Start that sentence again, because you cut out. The argument I make in the book.
Sure. the argument that I make in the book is that in many ways, the sugar workers in their insurrection pushed kind of Cuban communism to the left, and in fact pushed kind of the America's wide communist movement to the left. So the communists are claiming this whole insurrection, and the State Department, the U.S. State Department, is saying, yeah, it's a communist insurrection. They love to blame the Reds, and it makes sense to say that communists are leading it, but in fact, on the ground, everything is much more complicated. Communist organizers were not in command of events. They don't know what's going on. And in fact, this is the point I make, is that they themselves kind of pushed the Communist Party further than it was willing to go. And so doing, made themselves kind of revolutionary vanguard for anti-imperialist revolution in the Americas, at least for a few months. The whole world is watching. So I can parse that out by explaining a few of those steps. That be okay?
Sure.
Great. So for pushing the Communist Party further than it was willing to go, the Communist Party line in August of 1933 is telling the workers not to seize imperialist properties. Do not take over U.S.-owned factories, sugar enclaves, because that will provoke a U.S. intervention. And so that's officially the party line. But the workers don't care, and they seize them anyway. One of the documents that I had so much fun when I discovered is from the Caribbean Bureau, Moscow's Caribbean Bureau in New York, in which the Caribbean Bureau is trying to direct the party what to do. And it basically says, dear Cuban Communist Party, we told you not to tell the workers to seize foreign properties. But the workers seized them anyway. And now you have to basically say you're in command, which is a way of saying they're catching up. They're scrambling to catch up. And at the same time, the whole world is watching, right? The Caribbean Bureau in New York is watching, Moscow's watching. There's all this leftist press coverage, and it's not just the communist left, right? There's Carlton Beals watching. The Black press in the United States, the Afro-American newspapers are paying attention. You have all of these different groups kind of saying, look, the Cuban Revolution is a really big deal. It's an important anti-imperialist revolution. We should study it and replicate it. And that the sugar workers are the vanguard of that revolution, because they are multiracial, multinational, and fighting together and seizing imperialist properties. And so in the United States, there's this brief but important "Hands Off Cuba" campaign. And we've heard "Hands Off Cuba" before, right? That's the slogan that will emerge again in the 1960s. And this earlier campaign, the idea is to protect Cuba from a U.S. intervention. And Cubans themselves were aware of all of this international tension. There's newspapers are circulating back. I found all these documents in which U.S. consuls and Cuban authorities are reporting on merchant mariners trying to throw propaganda off boats into the launches to try to get word out, and everybody's sharing information. So I just think it's this really interesting moment where sugar workers who were supposedly isolated, supposedly backward, supposedly unorganizable, are actually pushing the party, pushing the America's wide movement, and making themselves the vanguard of, revolutionary anti-imperialism in the Americas.
Well, those of us more familiar with the post-1959 period, or even the contemporary situation in Cuba, would find a couple of ironies in all that you have examined and found in your book. One is first that Cuba goes from being the world's largest sugar producer to around 20 years ago producing none. And to this day, has been importing sugar from neighboring countries in order to just fulfill local domestic demand for sugar, or what's supposedly available through the ration as a guarantee. So there's one irony. But the second, which I think is also rather important to note, is that after Cuba's revolution of 1959 adopts communism, one of the very first things that happens is that strikes are effectively criminalized. Workers in Cuba can no longer protest the nature of management or ownership, because both of those are the state, and supposedly the state represents the interests of workers. So ideologically and legally, it becomes impossible for workers to replicate something on which they had relied as an instrument of leverage and to further their own rights. So I wonder, there are many other things that I might mention that, we can learn from looking at this particular story of Cuba in the past. But I wonder if you would like to add to sort of a set of lessons or, things that we can learn from looking at these sugar enclaves, the cosmopolitan enclaves, and the story of sugar workers that your book is devoted to.
I can give it a go. So, your point, I mean, it's a tricky point, right? Because all of the exploitive, sugar-dependent capitalism that was going on in the 1920s and 30s in Cuba was, right? It was really brutal. And I'm cognizant of the fact, I mean, it was exploitive. Workers were subject to very real abuse and actual violence. It wasn't pretty. So I'm very cognizant of the fact that my book, that I don't want to paint this rosy picture of like workers, rubbing shoulders, of diverse, cosmopolitan, culturally rich towns where everybody's happy and singing the internationale on the streets, and things are going well. I try not to paint that picture, and I hope I don't. But there is vibrant civic society that comes with being an economic hub of activity, and being a center where people are trading, nonstop. So you're right. These there's no more sugar in this region. The mills now, you can see all this like photography on the internet of the mills just looking sad and dilapidated, and the residents just being old. You look through the photos, and everybody there is old, right? There's nobody young left. And so in a sense, it's ironically isolated again. But I still think, even though that like civic vibrancy didn't hold through the Revolution of 33, the Revolution of 59, lessons to be learned, right? So that I tell in the book kind of reverberate across time and space. The battles playing out in the 1920s and 30s continue, right? They continue right up into the revolution. So Fulgencio Batista, I haven't mentioned this yet, but he's from Banes. And he is biggest supporters, the Diaz-Balart family, is the eldest is a mayor of Banes during the Revolution of 33. He's momentarily removed from office. His son goes on to be a founding member of Batista's Youth League, a point you made to me during my manuscript review. And then, and also been a minister of governance after the 52 coup. And then his grandsons are involved in Cuban American politics, representing Florida in the U.S. Congress, right? So that political strain continues. And then on the left, Blas Roca, who is the Eastern District Committee leader during the sugar insurgency, leads the Communist Party for over a quarter of a century. And Fidel Castro is from the area, right? These are big players. This is a kind of an overlooked region of Cuba. His father sold fruit to the United Fruit Company, sold sugar to the United Fruit Company. And although he came of age in a later period, his politics are deeply shaped by the anti-imperialist populism that really emerged out of 33 and after. So in some ways, the struggles of the more famous, as you're pointing out, eras of Cuban history, get going in towns like Banes and other sugar towns of Northern Oriente in the 1920s and 30s. So I hope I do some kind of pre-history for people who are interested in later history. Some other points of how I think this helps us understand the world at large, or has some wider relevance, is that for historians, especially of the global left, this study challenges our conventional thinking about where the centers of oppositional politics are, radical politics. So like we both just discussed, the sugar economy's gone, but sugar dependency, the sugar companies proclaimed they were cutting everybody off. But in fact, they were doing the opposite. And out of this interesting mix, you have really surprising consequences, like the proliferation of radical movements for the transnational labor class, anti-fascist solidarity. And they're not just existing in these towns, they're leading them, right? So it's a surprising reminder that we don't know where the hubs of radicalism are going to be. And then finally, and I'm in a mood, right? We're talking now in early 2025. Um, Trump has been president for a matter of weeks, and things are shifting so rapidly here. But I think there's some lessons for the global left, and I don't know exactly what to call it. And I'm trying to step back and think about it. But it seems like what I describe can kind of critique a little provincialism on our part. So you have these subjugated workers working for the poster child of, U.S. economic imperialism in Latin America, El Pulpo, United Fruit, right? But they're forming these big picture systemic critiques in their conditions, and they're tackling head on really international and in international ways, racial subjugation, labor exploitation, imperialist capitalism. Their sense of global interconnectedness, without the benefit of the internet or cell phones, was profound. The striking workers at Tasajo, they sent off telegrams to Germany condemning Hitler, right? The other striking workers start debating the Mexican Revolution and thinking widely about international radicalism. So I see the book as kind of, maybe this is a bit of a stretch, but it's like I have to figure out what I've been doing for the last 10 years of my life. I see the book as calling us to look a little bit more systematically, more internationally in our own struggles and organizing strategies. So I hope just by looking at the example they give us, we have some hints of ways to proceed in a less closed way.
Yes, I mean, I want to just conclude by pointing out once again that these are not just cosmopolitan enclaves. In some ways, through your examples of Fidel Castro being raised right next to Banes, his father working for the United Fruit Company by producing sugar and making millions from that. And then the Asparad family being from that same exact town and having held political power there. Fulgencio Batista having also been from the same place. I mean, Banes alone is a cradle of so much political struggle, both right-wing politics and left-wing politics and everything in between in some respects. So the book is a really extraordinary contribution. I want to thank you for doing it, for publishing it with the University of Florida, and for all that you are contributing to scholarship and knowledge of Cuba's history. Thank you so much.
Thank you. This has been fun. Thank you. I really appreciate it.